In this video, we're going to show you to install the shock assembly on your Nissan Frontier located behind your front wheels. Using a 21mm socket, go ahead, loosen and remove your lug nuts. Go ahead and grab that wheel, remove it, and set it aside. Now with the wheel off, we can go ahead and see our shock unit right here, and it comes down. Lower control arm is right down here, and there's a 19mm bolt and nut on here securing the shock to the control arm. So we're going to use our socket, extension, and our impact gun, and then we're going to use a 19mm on the nut side. And let's go ahead and loosen this stuff. Let's go ahead and remove that bolt. Go ahead and use a punch here to knock that bolt out. Using a 15mm deep socket, we're going to access the 3 nuts along the top of our strut assembly. Now we did soak this down in some rust penetrant. Now our shock base can't come out enough because our sway-bar end link is in the way. So we're going to use our 18mm socket. If your base is spinning like ours, just go ahead and grab it with a pair of pliers. Now that we have our sway-bar end link disconnected, this bracket right here for our ABS wire needs to be removed. We're going to use our 13mm socket. Right around the back side of the knuckle is going to be a single bolt for that. We're going to use our 12mm socket to go ahead and remove the bolt on the back side here. Go ahead and pop that bracket free. Set that off to the side. Go ahead and grab that assembly, pull that out and drop it down. Gotta wiggle that out. With our shock and spring assembly inside of the compressor tool, we're going to take a crayon and we want to mark the position of the cap, the spring, all the way down. That way there, when we install the new shock, we can go ahead and install everything directly in the same exact position. Now the pigtail of the spring stops in the stopper right here, so you can't change that. However, the top can be altered. So right where this is here, for the stud, we're going to come down and mark the spring. Mark it in a couple spots straight down in case you happen to rub one off while handling the component. Now we're going to compress this here. Make sure that you're using the proper tool, you're wearing safety glasses, and do not stand in front of the shock and spring when you're compressing this. We're going to compress this first, and then we're going to loosen and remove this nut up top. Now we have our spring compressed. You can grab that shock underneath and wiggle that around. We're going to use our 19mm socket to loosen and remove this nut. We're going to hold that shock on the bottom. Sometimes you have to work the nut up and down to get that to come off all the way. Go ahead, lower the assembly down. Remove that. Now we dropped our shock out here. A bushing with the sleeve dropped out as well. Now this just goes into the upper bearing plate. So when assembling, you're just going to swap this over and push it on like that, and then we'll feed this up into the spring assembly. Go ahead and push that shock up into that bearing plate. And go ahead and get that nut installed. You can see right here, the yellow mark had moved, so we're just going to reposition that to our spring and our rubber bushing. And we're going to go ahead and tighten this down. Now on the top here, we're going to use our 8mm on the top of the shock shaft. There's 2 little notches here to pop that onto. And then we're going to start to tighten this down using our 18mm wrench. And we're just going to do this by hand until we can go ahead and get this snug down. Now at this point, we have our markings all lined up here. The pigtail for our spring is in place. We'll finish tightening or snugging up the top here. All right, with this snug, I'm going to go ahead and slowly release our coil spring compressor here, and then we'll finish up by torquing the upper nut. With the tension released off of our spring assembly, and this is expanded, let's go ahead and torque down the upper nut. And you want to go ahead and torque this upper nut to 30 foot-pounds. Now that we're torqued to 30 foot-pounds, go ahead and remove your shock and spring assembly from the compressor tool and install it in your vehicle. Feed that up into place and then push the shock into the lower control arm. With that set in place, we can now go ahead and install the 3 nuts on the top. And we're just throwing these nuts on just to hold the top of that strut assembly in place. Before we tighten these down, we are going to install the lower horizontal bolt in that strut. Let's install our ABS wire bracket. Now there's a little tab on the top side right above the bolt hole. Now that we have the bracket in place, let's go ahead and get that bolt installed. Thread that in as far as you can by hand. Now we're just going to grab our ratchet and we're going to tighten that down by hand. You just want to make this snug. Once that bolt bottoms out, you got to give it a little bit more. And if your ABS wire had popped out like ours did, be sure to put that back in like that. We want to go ahead and install our lower bolt here in our shock assembly. You can go ahead and put that bolt in, and it's not quite lining up with the hole in the shock. So we can go ahead and lift that control arm, get that to line up, and tap that bolt in. Once we get that bolt in, go ahead and get that nut started. I have to work that bolt back just a little bit so we can have clearance for that nut in there. Go ahead and work that sway bar end link around. Install the nut for the sway bar end link. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and snug down that bolt for the end link. Before we tighten down the lower bolt and the upper nuts on our strut assembly, we want to go ahead and compress the suspension into what we call the neutral ride height. This is when the vehicle will be on the ground with the wheels on and the weight of the vehicle is compressing the suspension. The way we're going to duplicate that right now is to simply use a jack underneath the control arm. I'm going to go ahead and jack this up. And we're going to raise it until the vehicle just starts to come off of our lift. In your case, it will be your jack stands just where it starts to lift up. I'm going to go ahead and tighten down our lower bolt here. Once we're done with this lower bolt here, I want to go ahead and tighten up the 3 nuts on the top. Now with the suspension compressed up, you have a lot more room underneath the upper control arm. Go ahead and run those nuts down the rest of the way by hand to bottom them out. Now that we have those snug, let's go ahead and torque these down, and then we'll torque the lower shock bolt. Let's go ahead and torque down the 3 nuts on the top to 22 foot-pounds. Let's go ahead and torque down our lower bolt to 98 foot-pounds. Here we go. Good. Torque down the sway bar end link nut to 67 foot-pounds. At this point here, we can now go ahead and remove our jack from the lower control arm. Now that we have our strut assembly installed and our sway bar end link secured and everything is done here, let's go ahead and install our wheel. And at this point here, you go ahead and repeat this process for the passenger side. Don't forget to bring the vehicle down and get an alignment performed so you don't prematurely wear any other components. And make sure you have good tire wear. Grab your wheel, go ahead and line it up, set it into place. I'm going to start all of our lug nuts by hand. Once we have all these started, let's go ahead and snug them down. Let's go ahead and torque down our lug nuts to 98 foot-pounds. You want to do this in a crisscross pattern.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.